Hello, everyone. My name is Laura Wallen, and I am here to talk to you about a research that I conducted. And so I picked media framing theory because it's something that I'm really interested in. I've always been fascinated with the idea that an article can be constructed in a certain way to convey a particular message, and the way that the reporter organizes the information, chooses what to include, not to include, all of that, really interesting. And so with that said, I conducted a comparative content analysis of news coverage in Sweden and the United States, in the context of COVID. The media framing of epidemics has previously proven to influence the public perception and behaviors in experimental settings, and all of that research was actually confirmed after COVID-19 started and began to spread actually in 2019 globally. Even though we've had similar outbreaks before, the world was not prepared to deal with something as massive as we have been dealing to this date. And so, as soon as everything started to get really bad, every country, took appropriate measures. They had border restrictions, they had emergency measures, all in place to offset the disease. Some of the regions had very aggressive measures, and some of them had very relaxed tactics. But regardless, I mean, under these circumstances, the digital media took this worldwide crisis as an opportunity to frame the event and massively influence public discourse. And it actually led to the confusion or the perplexing understanding of the pandemic. And two countries in particular, the United States and Sweden, had extremely different strategies in their approach to the spread of COVID-19. Specifically in the beginning of March and April of 2020. So in Sweden, the government didn't enforce any strict lockdowns. They were encouraged to voluntarily social distance, but the schools remained open. People were still going to work, even though they were allowed to work from home. And then all other activities remained as usual. On the other hand, the United States government, they took a they got a slow start on the problem, but they allowed state governors to issue stay-at-home orders, social distancing, and ban public gatherings as recommended by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The policies were completely different for Sweden and the United States, but the behaviors of United States residents actually mirrored the Swedish guidelines because the majority of people here hesitated to implement the considerations from health officials. And so a lot of research has pointed to politically driven actions. Um, these people basically were not following the rules because their decision not to do it was politically driven. And so, with that said, I was really interested to see how those two countries frame the social distancing practice. I wanted to see if the media in the United States played a role in shaping either a confusive or dismissive public opinion due to media saturation, because we saw all over the news. I mean, every single day we were getting swamped with updates, and so these are the questions that I wanted to answer, based on the premise that one government was very lenient in their strategy, and then the other government mandated their citizens to stay inside as much as possible but resisted. And so This research offers a qualitative content analysis of online articles from Sweden and the United States, specifically articles published in Dagens Nyheter, which is daily news in Swedish, and the New York Times. Even though a significant amount of research has been done regarding the pandemic, limited studies actually focus on how countries have framed the measures to contain the outbreak with respect to physical distancing. And so this research added value to the field of communication, specifically media framing theory.
For the literature review, I organized everything into 4 different sections, as you can see here. And so I'm going to kind of give you a quick overview of each section. Starting with the first section on media framing history and theory, I looked at the work of Goffman from 1974. He was the first scholar to concentrate on framing as a form of communication. And then Entman in 1993 later defined media framing as perceived reality, which I think is probably the most accurate description of media framing, which is in line with social constructionism. The biggest takeaway from this is that media framing forms meaning in public discourse, and also people's perceptions are contingent upon the saliency of the information, which is basically the importance of the information, and valence. Valence means the tone of the information, whether that's positive, negative, or neutral. For the second section, I wanted to look at the importance of media framing in epidemics and what previous research on news framing of Ebola, SARS, MERS, and others had found. And it looks like framing of these issues in news coverage is often inadequate, not to mention limited or incomplete. And seems like there are some challenges, and one of the challenges is that there is a disconnect between the experts and what the average person understands about the crisis. And then the second challenge is that people always go to mass media to find out their information. So they're not going directly to the CDC website or the World Health Organization website. They're just going directly to news media. And so the other problem with that is that journalists exaggerate and they take messages from health organizations out of context only to drive the consumer culture to their site. For news coverage of COVID-19 in the United States, the media has created not only a wave of panic due to misleading information about health and science reports, but it also has created a sense of fear and stigma, prejudice, and perhaps the most common sentiment among Americans is that they feel defeated. They feel negative about the whole social distancing situation, and all of this has been recorded in research that came from Twitter data. For this subsection, I focused on research that has looked at framing of COVID-19 in the United States, and I came across the research conducted by Bolton et al., and they found that the way that the United States framed the origins of COVID-19 actually were linked to the attribution of blame, in this case China, conspiracy rhetoric, and pro-social behaviors, all of which incited cascading effect. And what I mean by cascading effects is just the public dismissive and skeptical behavior, and overlooking, the credibility of science reports. This is the conspiracy effect. That's what they call it. And individuals became less likely to view actions such as wearing masks or frequently washing one's hands, maintaining 6 feet of social distance, and all of that. They saw it as something that was not real. Moving on to section number 4, which is news coverage of COVID-19 in Sweden. I couldn't find any articles that looked at news coverage specifically in Sweden and how it has influenced its citizens' behaviors. I did come across, however, a lot of articles that looked at the statistics and the social demographic data that is readily available, and this is the number of cases, death rates, etc. In terms of framing COVID-19 in Sweden, again, I could not find any studies that were related to the local media, and so the only thing that I was able to find was a study conducted by Irwin 2020, but they looked at how international media framed Sweden's take on the pandemic. To fill these gaps in the literature, I came up with one overarching research question and 4 specific components. So the main research question asks, how have 2 major media outlets framed social distancing as related to COVID-19? And then the subsequent ones are, what are the framing mechanisms for social distancing in digital media employed by DN and NYT? The next one is, what is the tone and scope of social distancing in news stories published in DN and NYT? And when comparing news frames relating to social distancing between the 2 major media outlets, are there differences or similarities between the way each framed this guideline? And then lastly, does the way digital media frame COVID-19 guidelines pertaining to social distancing affect the perception of the measures to its readers? For the methodology section, I conducted a qualitative content analysis on 12 articles published in DN and NYT. The articles were conveniently chosen by using a specific timeline. So since Sweden didn't enact a very strict lockdown, I had to use a really long time frame, which is why I did March 3rd through June 3rd. And then for NYT, because we had a spike of lockdowns at the beginning of April, based on the mobility data tracked by the CDC, I chose April 1st through April 11th. Then the search function on each website was utilized, and I typed in different keywords such as social distancing, stay at home, and lockdown. And I made sure that current events associated with the economy, politics, climate, or science were excluded from the convenient sample. After I was able to identify 6 articles for DN and 6 articles for NYT, I saved each article as a Word document, and I started to do the data analysis. And I relied on the list of frames approach suggested by Plancard. And so this is a qualitative text analysis measurement to identify framing mechanisms. And then to determine the tone and scope of news stories in reference to social distancing, I used 3 different categories. So number 1, I categorized the articles by length, and then I did a word count in each one of them, and then I determined the valence, whether it was positive, negative, or neutral. Moving on to the results question. Research question number 1 looked at how 2 major media outlets, DN and NYT, framed social distancing as related to COVID-19. And both provided great insights influenced by their corresponding government actions, but NYT exploited the richness of the media more. because they relied on multiple framing strategies in their discourse to social distancing, and DN covered the subject sparingly, but their framing was not as exhaustive as NYT. They had a very minimalist presentation, and they placed social distancing as an issue of lesser importance. Then for research question 1A, the specific framing mechanisms for social distancing in digital media employed by NYT and DN are displayed in the following table. And it looks like for DN, they relied on two particular framing mechanisms, which are the selection of quotes and leads. They also appear to use a balanced number of photographs as well as headlines and kickers. For some reason, they didn't include any organization logos in their articles. They also didn't include concluding statements or paragraphs of other current events. Something that I found pretty interesting is that the photo captions were not consistent with the number of photographs that were portrayed, and so they don't always include a description of the visuals. And lastly, subheads and statistics charts and graphs were the least framing mechanisms applied. NYT followed a similar framing pattern with the selection of quotes and leads. The number of photographs, in addition to headlines and kickers, were pretty much the same as DN. However, they seem to focus more on the selection of sources or affiliations, inclusion of concluding statements or paragraphs of articles, logos, statistics, charts, and graphs. The number of photo captions was consistent with the number of photographs, and the subheads were the least framing mechanism they use. For research question 1B, the tone and scope of social distancing in news stories published in the NYT and DN. The results are in the following table, and it looks like the length of articles in the end was particularly short, averaging just 640 words. The shortest article only contained 358 words, and the longest one was just shy of 1,100 words. The tone was mostly neutral, as they focused on topics like things to do at home, recommendations for animals, opting to stay indoors during Easter, and healthcare staff messages. Overall, DN's approach was quick and impartial regarding social distancing. NYT articles were long, averaging 1,113 words. The longest article was 1,558 words, and the shortest one was 581 words. The tone was both positive and negative, presenting the good and bad aspects of physical distancing. Some of the positive messages dealt with new ways to celebrate birthday parties and how elders and children exchange cards and street closures for proper distancing during walks. The negatively toned subjects related to how some people in states were resisting of stay-at-home rules and closing businesses to comply with social distancing requirements. So with that said, the NYT went for the long, extended framing version of the government rules, and they ensured that the pros and cons were covered. For research question 1C, there were some major differences and similarities between the way that each media outlet framed the social distancing parameters. For disparities, DN used a total of 93 frames, whereas the NYT used significantly more, totaling up to 149. NYT concentrated more on concluding statements or paragraphs of articles, logos, as well as statistics, charts, and graphs, and DN did not. Concerning the similarities between the two, they both consistently selected a decent number of quotes and leads, number of photographs, and overall headlines and kickers. For the last research question, the answer is yes. According with the data presented in this paper, it appears that the saturation of media frames portrayed by NYT under-delivered the emphasis on physical distancing, and so it influenced how people digested the seriousness of this guideline. The neutral and shorter approach by the end seemed to be more effective since Swedish people opted to stay home even though it was not mandated by the government. In summary, shorter articles with minimal frames influence individuals in their willingness to social distance. In this light, the overwhelming use of frames and lengthy articles published by the NYT was the catalyst in the lack of compliance by U.S. citizens and its cascading effect of conspiracy rhetoric. After all, previous research has shown that media saturation impacts the public's perception of a health crisis and even journalists' exaggeration of events. As a consequence, the amplified perceived reality of the social distancing practice after COVID-19 explains how framing led to a confusing public discourse of the pandemic in the United States. And this is all consistent with the poor handling of media frames and mistakes done in previous epidemics. The recommendations based on this research is for journalists to take an impartial approach to news framing and also to limit the number of frames to appropriately shape the public's interpretation of a topic. For future research, it would be worth replicating the study using additional media outlets and additional articles. And media coverage in Sweden presents a wide range of opportunities for study, and Nordic countries as a whole. Alright, and that is a wrap. Thank you so much for watching.